It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to kind of be able to talk about the topic of GDPR today because it's really top of mind for any worldwide organization, not just the EU, but North America as well. So let's get into some of the agenda of what I want to walk through today. First is just a kind of a general GDPR overview, right? Set the stage on what some of the major impacts are, and then most importantly, and for many of you listening, most importantly, is I want to talk about some of the spending that we think that GDPR is driving, where that money is going, and kind of why it matters. Second, I want to touch on what GDPR means for information governance and email archiving in specific. IDC, we do a ton of GDPR research, but my job as a storage analyst is to kind of connect the dots between what GDPR means from a storage standpoint, right? What technology are GDPR initiatives driving, and also, most importantly, what technologies, email archiving included, how can those really help users meet their GDPR requirements? And then lastly, GDPR is a very cumbersome regulation, and a lot of the challenges we see with customers is just finding a place to start. So I'll walk you through some of the assessment activities that we think are kind of the most logical starting points, and really how to just cost effectively tackle your kind of GDPR jumping off point, so to speak. When we think about GDPR overall, the kind of one-liner is that GDPR is a game changer. It's not the next Y2K scare. It's not a marketing scam. It's not benign. GDPR regulators can levy some serious monetary fines, and they even have the power to restrict some of your business operations if you're not in compliance. Most importantly, it's not just an EU issue, right? We're going to hammer this point home throughout the presentation. It is a global regulation that is relevant to any company in the world handling personally identifiable information of EU citizens. So even IP addresses of an EU citizen can be classified as PII under GDPR. And there's an extraterritoriality clause within GDPR, which means that the jurisdiction reaches outside the EU, right? And regulators can go after North American companies or companies in Asia, really anywhere worldwide, you're liable under GDPR. So what we're looking at is GDPR was officially adopted as a law, as a regulation in 2016. It's going to be enforced on May 25th, 2018. It's both a business and we think it should be considered both a business and an IT initiative. There's some unique things about GDPR in the way that it's structured, right? It's not binary. There isn't a kind of a GDPR on and off switch that you can flick as an organization. While there's a defined start date on May 25th, there's no defined end date or state of compliance nirvana that goes along with GDPR, right? This is a multi-year, long-term initiative that we think users should approach as kind of a continuum, right? There's stages of non-compliance, good compliance, bad compliance when it comes to GDPR, and it's going to be an ongoing initiative for any organization that's trying to kind of do their best to meet GDPR compliance. And a lot of it depends on, how you approach GDPR, how it's implemented. A lot of it will depend on your industry, the data you have under your management, your position as a data processor or a data controller. All of these variables will kind of determine which articles are most important for you within GDPR, and really the range of compliance initiatives that you need to pursue. But regardless of kind of the differences in GDPR, the uncertainty, we're projecting that GDPR is going to have a real impact on spending and on spending in the storage market in particular. So this is where some of IDC's market forecast data starts to come into play. And from 2017 to 2021, we're forecasting that GDPR-related storage spending in Western Europe will grow at a CAGR of 24.5%. So really the trend is spending is going to peak in 2018, and overall it will exceed 3.3 billion in storage. So let's dig a little bit deeper just kind of into the market forecast figures as a whole. And there's a lot of data on this slide, a lot of arrows and lines, so let me kind of walk you through step by step really what this means and why it's important to you. So again, this is Western Europe only. IDC has not completed a forecast similar to this in North America, but we're currently working on it. So what you're looking at is a forecast of GDPR-related storage spending in Western Europe only. But you should care about this trend, right, the peak in spending in 2018, because we expect a similar trend to happen in the U.S. and North America. Logically, it should be 1 to 2 years later, so maybe you'll see the spending peak in North America or in the U.S. in 2019 instead of 2018. But really, if you look at the CAGRs, the growth figures, you can see clearly that there's a material impact here, right? And in North America, whether it's 1 billion or 10 billion, really it's hard to say yet, but the point is that there's going to be an impact to storage spending. It's most likely will be kind of a double-digit growth impact, and it has a long tail, right? This is a 2 to 5 year view where storage initiatives and spending are going to continue to be driven by GDPR. And we're seeing some North American organizations respond to GDPR already. Some of the most ambitious organizations will have a GDPR compliance strategy in place before the regulation comes into effect, and they're making investment decisions now. But then there's also kind of a portion of what we would call GDPR laggards who are either uncertain of how GDPR will impact their organization or just kind of unwilling to implement the necessary technology or infrastructure changes. But what I would kind of hammer home the final point here is that there's a relatively short window of time to make storage technology decisions as they relate to GDPR that are going to have a 5+ year impact on your organization. So as you can see from the research we've done in Western Europe, the impact is real. It's driving real spending, and really the trend, while it may be 1 or 2 years later, it's going to be similar in North America. So let's dive into kind of what GDPR means for some of those storage technologies, information governance, data management, and email archiving in particular. So really, our advice to any organization is to look at GDPR as a storage security and compliance modernization opportunity. Even though it's a new regulation, there's some complex requirements to meet. Really, there's an opportunity here around modernizing your storage infrastructure and technology. So that includes email archiving, data protection and recovery, and security software solutions and services. They're all key components to compliance. And what's also important is to not approach GDPR in a vacuum, right? Your archiving and backup and DR and security software and services providers are an important part of the GDPR puzzle. Not only are they supplying GDPR-related solutions, but they're affected by the same regulations that you may be. So in many circumstances, your provider is a data processor or a data controller themselves, right? And they have to comply with the same policies and they're designing their tools and their services to be GDPR compliant. So they're tackling some of the same issues that you may be. So really sometimes the first logical step is to look at your provider as a valuable resource, right? A partner in tackling GDPR challenges. And so what we do a lot of talking about too are some of the most challenging aspects of GDPR just because of some of the ambiguity around GDPR. So a lot of what we help organizations do is to better articulate the business case for GDPR, especially outside the EU, right? It's from a practical perspective, a lot of times it's hard for a non-EU based organization to go to their boss or their purchase decision maker and say, we need to comply with an EU regulation and we're going to need X amount of budget to do so. That can be kind of a far-fetched proposition at the outset. So we recommend kind of focusing on creating a cost-benefit assessment or risk assessment of GDPR, how it relates to your organization, and really those are kind of some of the first steps to take to help build the business case for GDPR. And then finally, almost every organization communicates through email, right? So this is one of the first content areas that will need to be addressed by GDPR. So it's an essential pillar of GDPR compliance, or email communications might be a roadblock for GDPR compliance depending on the way you look at it. But for any regulated organization, GDPR compliance means reevaluating email security, the compliance and email archiving are an essential piece of that puzzle. So let me drill into some recent archiving and e-discovery data that IDC did. This is buyer survey data, and I want to bring this into the conversation now, just to show you that I'm not making up how important email archiving and archiving are to the GDPR story, right? We're seeing some real interesting sentiment from the buyers that we surveyed about how they're thinking about archiving and using archiving. So what you're looking at here is an excerpt from IDC's Archiving and e-discovery buyer survey. This is 2017 data. What I've done here is we asked respondents to look at each of these variables from an importance standpoint. So what are the most important capabilities you consider when choosing an archiving solution? They're rating these on a scale of 1 to 5, and what I've done is just taken out the 4s and the 5s, right, and presented them here to you in a ranked order. So these are people who said very important or important. So these are kind of the, in a nutshell, this is boiling down the most important capabilities that buyers are looking for in their archiving solution. And right at the top, you can see legal discovery requirements, ensuring compliance to government and internal records and retention policies are number 1 and number 2 when it came to important capabilities. So these are capabilities that will have an extra bright spotlight shown on them when it comes to GDPR implementation. And buyers already care about these capabilities. So it's only going to make them more important. And you can see kind of contrasting to this, you can see how far down the list that reduced storage costs are. So for many customers, they're approaching archiving from more of a high-stakes security and compliance position. It's not just about implementing archiving, whether it's email archiving or a different file archiving solution from a cost standpoint, right? Reducing those storage costs, improving storage capacity. Really, the archiving solutions and archiving platforms have kind of are quickly transitioning to more of a higher value proposition for many buyers. So one quick note I want to add to is within the survey, we asked a lot of questions around archiving budget, the types of content being archived, business initiatives and how archiving solutions support them. And I wanted to point out that email archiving is still the #1 content type. So it's still surpassed all other data types, social media, voice, video. So although we're not asking specifically about email archiving in every single question, I think the fact that email archiving as a content type is still the #1 makes all of the responses, the findings of the survey, very relevant to email archiving overall. One more archiving buyer survey slide, just to continue reinforcing this point. We also asked about we just looked at top capabilities, and now we're looking at customers' top priorities. So this is kind of a mix of business and IT priorities. Again, I'm presenting you the same kind of breakdown of the data where we're just pulling out the 4s and the 5s, the high priority and the very high priority and high priority respondents, and ranking those in order. So looking at the results when we asked what are the top priorities when deploying an archiving solution, you can see secure deletion, e-discovery support, things like supervision, legal hold, etc., are the top 4 and 5 priorities. And you can see some other interesting responses in here too, where you have things like big data initiatives, right? Advanced analytics capabilities. Really, all of these priorities are capabilities which are essential to a range of compliance initiatives, especially some of the initiatives that are going to be enforced under law through GDPR. So the fact that buyers are looking to their archiving solution or platform to tackle these priorities, and that these are some of the top 5 priorities when you look at a mix of business and IT, it's extremely interesting. And again, I think it highlights that there's a shift towards higher value initiatives, and really this is kind of illustrating that changing role of archiving to higher value and to a position of driving compliance and enforcement and data management in ways that these hadn't been kind of top of mind maybe in the past 2 to 5 years even. So now that we've now that we've talked about kind of the importance of some storage tools, storage software tools, especially archiving, and how they relate to GDPR, right? How some of those higher value, whether it's e-discovery or data analytics capabilities, can come into play and really aid GDPR compliance. I want to take a couple seconds to kind of maybe back up and talk more about how you should begin tackling, especially from a storage perspective or from an IT storage admin perspective, how you can start tackling logically what some of the steps are for implementing kind of a cost-effective GDPR approach or GDPR strategy. So we've spoken with from everybody from regulators to GDPR solutions providers to organizations implementing GDPR. And what we found is, especially among North American organizations, that decision paralysis is very real, and it's a significant threat because of the uncertainty around GDPR, because there are myriad places to begin implementation and really no end point. And a lot of uncertainty around how certain articles, certain regulations might affect a certain organization. We see a lot of organizations either delaying decision-making or just taking a kind of wait-and-see approach. So what we try to recommend is not to take a wait-and-see approach, right? There are a finite amount of regulators. Certainly not everybody will be fined. There is potential for some organizations to kind of fly under the radar and wait and see how the initial fines are doled out, especially North American providers, and then kind of establish a strategy based on the initial litigations that they see. But there is also the very real threat that North American companies could be one of those targeted for that initial litigation, and obviously there's significant monetary penalties to be paid, as well as kind of the reputation and the negative perception and the impact of being some of the first to be fined under GDPR. So one of the first steps, one of the easiest steps probably for organizations to take, is to ask your provider what their compliance roadmap is. I mentioned before that this is kind of a, your provider can be seen as a partner in GDPR compliance, right? They're dealing with a lot of the same regulations that you are. So ask your provider what obligations they're working to meet, maybe where the gaps are in their portfolio currently and how they're working to address or have already addressed as many GDPR compliance capabilities as they can before the deadline. And make sure that their product roadmap, right, for the ongoing security and compliance capabilities is kind of aligned to maybe some of the requirements your organization has, either from a legal or an industry standpoint. And then the second most important step to be taking internally is to be using GDPR as an opportunity to convince your internal stakeholders that it's worth allocating budget to addressing the storage and security infrastructure requirements, which kind of enable GDPR compliance, right? And GDPR, we've seen organizations allocating budget from security, from infrastructure and storage, from their digital modernization budget, from their marketing budget, right? GDPR kind of is an all-encompassing regulation, and really the opportunity to allocate budget from a wide range of both IT and business budgets is there. So being able to, I think, demonstrate the cost of non-compliance and then compare that to the cost of maybe some of the targeted infrastructure or storage related upgrades that are necessary, and the positive impact that these upgrades are going to have on long-term governance and compliance. I think from a storage perspective, that will help present kind of a compelling case within your organization that that this is a serious regulation and not only an opportunity to avoid fines, but an opportunity to create infrastructure modernization, storage modernization, and implement really some high-value tools. So, all right, so we've talked about some of the kind of the key challenges with maybe taking action around GDPR and how you can form a strategy and a game plan. And so this is my final slide, and what I want to leave you with is what is IDC's GDPR technology framework. And so this will help you kind of compartmentalize and maybe visualize a little bit better what some of those strategic priorities might be for your organization. This gives you a little bit more context about what we just discussed, and there's 3 major segments you can see here. They're not meant to be followed in any particular order or any tier of importance. They're just 3 different ways that might make sense to start identifying some of your GDPR needs and tackle them. So the first, I'll go top to bottom, the first, information governance. This is all about data discovery at its core. So a lot of the initial steps that organizations are taking is just to understand the data that they have within their control, where it's located, what technology or users are accessing it, how sensitive it is, right? And once they understand kind of their data, how sensitive it is, and they've identified where it is, then you can understand well, which GDPR articles might be most applicable to my data? Where am I maybe lacking in security and compliance capabilities, and then what do I need to kind of identify the tools or services you need to bring things up to speed and make sure you're compliant. The second is around meeting specific requirements. So I'd say that this would resonate well with some of the more mature or heavily regulated industries, right, where there's a lot of, with organizations that have tools and services in place, have a mature governance strategy. This is more about identifying the policies that you have in place, whether it's for data access or erasure. Maybe organizations already have set up different user profiles that have access to certain data. So once you understand your policies in place and where some of the gaps are, then it's about identifying maybe there's one or two additional policies or requirements you should put in place that are GDPR related, can help you make sure you're in alignment with GDPR. So this is not necessarily from the technology standpoint, but more of kind of the business process standpoint. The last is around state-of-the-art. So the recommendation at the highest level is to review state-of-the-art, because really this is, when it comes to there's two articles in question here. It's Article 25 and 32. They cover data protection by design and default and security. And these are some of the most, from what we've seen, these are some of the most ambiguous and challenging articles for organizations to apply and define in their own context. So for some, it's a good place to start and kind of get a foundation of what these articles mean to your organization, what it means to be compliant, what it means to make a best effort at identifying security breaches and complying with different regulations. So this is kind of interpreting state-of-the-art, what it means to your organization, and then how it's going to be, what the impact to your organization will be in the eyes of regulators, right? This is kind of like I said, it's an ambiguous segment that applies to GDPR, but nonetheless, it's a very important place to start, maybe in terms of a risk assessment and a judgment call around what GDPR means for your organization. So with that, I'll wrap up and I'll hand it back over to Dan to do the rest of the presentation.